Silver Institute, and I'm part of the MCTAC team. Very fortunate and privileged to be joined today by Adam Falcone, who at this point has offered quite a bit of assistance to providers across New York State around contracting and Medicaid managed care. So what we're going to do today for this workshop office hour, which is sandwiched between two larger presentations, is really give folks who are attending a chance to ask questions about the exercise that everyone's going through and completing. We're happy and excited to see that over 30 exercises have already been submitted using the Qualtrics survey link. So we're really thrilled to see people engaging with the exercise, identifying areas of the template contract that they find to be problematic or things that they'd look to address. But so, again, the idea of having a workshop office hour isn't to inundate folks with any new information or like a long slide deck, but to quickly review just a couple of topics or things we think might be helpful, or referencing some of the questions we've been receiving over at mctac.info@nyu.edu, and really allocate the majority of the time for attendees and participants to have their questions asked. So really, thanks so much for joining us and participating in this workshop series. So a quick outline for folks. We imagine that many of the people attending today are well versed in this, but just as a refresher, so we're all on the same page in terms of what we're all engaged in here. So Adam offered a fantastic kickoff webinar presentation back on June 17th on the anatomy of a contract and outlining this team-based assignment for providers to complete. Participants have been reviewing the assignment, submitting questions, and then today we're engaged in this office hour where we'll be going through just some of the information we think is helpful, as well as offering folks a chance to ask other questions that are coming to mind. And then the deadline for submitting the assignment and submitting a response using a Qualtrics survey link is Monday, July 20th, end of the day. And then that gives us time to look through different approaches to what folks were doing with the contracts, different areas that people were noticing or not noticing, and put together a robust final offering on July 29th in the morning at 9:30. So registration links and all of the links have been sent around to folks, and you should have all of that. If you can't spot it or can't see it, please feel free again just to send us a quick email at mctac.info@nyu.edu. And we'll also be sending, in response to the office hour today, just a thanks for joining, and here's what we think is everything you might need. So sit tight if you think you're missing something. It'll be coming your way shortly. And just again, we strongly suggest folks review slides and recordings of the Managed Care Kickoff Series that was held in the fall of 2014, and a robust in-person series of contracting for managed care that Adam led, again, in the fall of 2014 and early 2015. So just a quick refresher, and we were so excited that we did that in Rochester, got left in the slides twice. So a quick refresher, we did an in-person contracting session. We did it 5 times. It was the same content in each, although the conversations tended to be very different, with different interests and different provider needs coming up in each. A recording of that training is available at mctac.org under the Tools and Resources page. And then we also offered to supplement that web-based offerings. So we offered managed care contracting the plan perspective, managed care contracting the provider perspective, and then Adam was nice enough to do, to whittle down a much larger 3.5-hour presentation into a short 45 minutes to an hour for a summary contracting overview, and then a short office hours just around contracting in general. Again, this office hour is designed for questions that you have, and specifically around the exercise itself. But as best as we're able, we're happy to answer other questions about contracting in general. So please feel free using the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen. And depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC, there's a little text bubble icon, sometimes with the word chat, that you can click on to open that up. And we just ask that if you are submitting questions, there's a drop-down item where you can choose who you send it to. You don't have to send it to all participants by any means, but it would be great if you could send it to all panelists, or the host and the presenter at least. Our tech guru, Morgan McGuire, who's listed as Amanda Alcantara on the sidebar, a little erroneously, is doing a great job helping to moderate some of this stuff, and then Adam and I are also at different computers. So modern technology is fantastic so we can be in different places, but it really is helpful for us all to be able to see the questions coming through. So thanks again for taking the time to, to click through that and get the questions in. And again, another advantage to office hours is we're a lot more open to answering questions in real time than when there's an hour or an hour and a half long presentation where questions are typically held to the end. So please send them in real time, especially if they're related to the slide content that is right in front of you. And we're happy to clarify as things are coming up throughout. With that, I would like just to introduce and welcome Adam Falcone, who again has done a robust number of trainings for us around this area, and we're just so pleased to have supporting providers in New York State around this transition to Medicaid managed care, specifically around contracting, and again working with us based on the feedback we received from the larger in-person and web-based offerings to put together this really interactive and this exercise for providers to work through, which we really hope will help to allay any concerns or any uncertainties about what this contracting with managed care is all about. So with that, just Adam's standard disclaimer, typical legalese, and I will pass the ball over to Adam to take it from here.
Great, thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone to today's office hours. As you gathered from Dan, I'm sure this is meant to be really the interactive component of the three-part series, where you have a chance to ask me questions about any of the provisions that is giving you some challenge in the sample contract that you received, or any of the other aspects that I've already covered in the prior webinars. Before we get to your questions, I just wanted to highlight a few components from our last webinar. The first is the 4 parts of the contract: the header, the contract provisions, the exhibits, and the reference documents. As I mentioned previously, the header and recitals sort of give you that backstory, explain why the parties are coming together. If the contract is sort of like telling a story or a play, this is where you find out who the participants are, who the characters are, and why they've come together to make promises to each other in the managed care contract. This part is not legally binding, but it's helpful background information. It's helpful information if there's any contractual disputes about the intent of the parties. The second part of the contract is the meat and potatoes, the contract provisions themselves. Those are the ones that really are the focus in your sample contract assignment, where it's intended that you identify potential provisions that might be disadvantageous to you and ones that you'd like to see changed. The third part is the exhibits to the contract. This is where the good stuff typically hides, what products from the MCO you'd be agreeing to participate in, what the scope of services are that you're agreeing to provide to patients, as well as the reimbursement rates or fees that the plan is going to pay you. They're moving pieces because plans can sort of insert the right exhibits for the right contract and the right provider, and sometimes this gets shuffled around a few times, and you may not have all the right exhibits in front of you, or you may provide more services than the plan recognizes or knows about. I've seen recently in some of the contracts I've reviewed in New York State that the plans actually been providing almost like a questionnaire to the behavioral health providers, asking them to identify what services they currently provide. Do you provide ACT or PROS? Do you provide other technical types of services? As an outpatient, do you have inpatient? The plans don't know this automatically, so they are actually asking the providers to tell them what they provide so that they can insert the right rates and the right exhibits into the contract. So do make sure you look at these exhibits, ensure that it covers the scope and breadth of services you provide, and if you don't, make sure you communicate that back to the plan representative so they can add additional products or services to your contract. And then the fourth are sort of the reference documents. These are documents incorporated by reference. This could be the plan's policies and procedures. the plan's provider manual, all of which become part and parcel with the contract, part of the four corners of the contract, and are essentially have the same contract effect as documents or provisions that are within the contract itself. In prior webinars and trainings I've talked about, it's helpful to develop a strategy or some sort of plan for how to go about reviewing the contracts. These contracts can be 40 or 50 pages long. I know they're not an easy read. I did have one behavioral health provider in New York State. The CEO read through each of the contracts recently and gave me questions based on some of the provisions that he didn't quite understand or didn't understand the intent and wanted me to look over. And I applauded him for actually taking the time to review each of the 3 contracts that he's received from MCOs to date. When you do receive a contract, I encourage you to find out from the MCO how quickly they expect you to turn it around, review it, and sign it. If that time frame isn't sufficient, then do go back and ask for an extension or additional time so you don't feel pressured to review or sign a document without having adequate time to assess whether it makes sense in its current format. That also means if you get a contract in an Adobe Acrobat PDF form of the contract, that form of the contract may not be as helpful for you in redlining or communicating comments back. Don't hesitate to ask the plan to provide it to you in Word version so that you can edit the text or comment on the text in the Word document. It makes it a little bit easier sometimes to be reviewing, especially as a group. If you're part of if you've developed a contract review team internally, having a document in Word version is probably easier to review as a group than a PDF document. It's also important to make sure you do have the right documents in front of you, the right exhibits, the right contract, and go back to the plan to ask for the correct ones if you don't have them all in front of you. If the plan has a provider manual, ask them for the link to the provider manual on their website so that you can look at areas that interest you. This might be prior authorization requirements or credentialing requirements. Fourth, it's important to assess the MCO's operational performance. If they have a track record in other parts of the state or in other states, whether they pay claims on time, whether they're difficult in how they implement any authorization processes or credentialing processes. This is often important to know. It can give you an idea of what terms to focus in on, potentially amending or negotiating with the particular plan, or whether it's helpful to seek higher rates because you may not have all your claims paid that you submit to the plan. And then lastly, assessing the MCO's financial stability. If they have money, then they have money to pay you. If they're in bankruptcy, they won't have money to pay you. So if you have a new plan that doesn't have those deep pockets, that may make you should sort of give those plans a second look. See whether you absolutely want to contract with them if they don't have deep resources. You may still want to or need to, but you may want to put provisions in the contract that allow you to terminate if they enter bankruptcy or become financially unstable. The next few slides should be familiar to you if you've seen our prior webinars. They give you some points for how to review the contract, some questions to ask yourself as you're reviewing the contracts. I've included here again Exhibit A, which are essentially at the end of this slide deck questions for particular provisions that you might want to look at in assessing the adequacy of provisions. You can use these Appendix A questions to go through the sample contract as part of the exercise as well. As you evaluate the contract, you want to be thinking in the back of your head, are these issues critical issues that you absolutely have to get changed before signing that contract because they are either unacceptable for the organization because they create too much risk or too much financial exposure to you? Are they just significant issues that you'd like to see changed? Or are they simply sort of in this green category, issues that would ideally be changed but are not absolutely essential? And here you have on the slide the first of the few slides that give you questions to assess particular provisions in the contract itself that you can use to analyze contracts. All right, Dan, do you want to take questions now, or do you want to just talk about how the exercise is going to be sort of reviewed?
Yeah, absolutely. So as folks have been listening to the presentation and thinking through some of the questions they might have, just wanted to encourage folks to send things in using the chat box again on the right-hand side of the screen, and to please be sure to use the drop-down to select to send to all panelists, which is just helpful on the tech side on our end. And we've got a few just questions off the top that we can start to run through as folks are sending in their information as well. But just one final reminder on how all this works. So we're asking folks to review and complete a short questionnaire assignment form using an online survey link around the template contract exercise by 5 p.m. on Monday, July 20th. So folks still have a good amount of time to spend with the exercise and to think through. And then also to be sure to register for the wrap-up with the assignment review. And of course, to feel free to bring questions after you've fully gone through the assignment around different ways that you approached it, different considerations, particularly around like what we'll call the red light, yellow light, green light slide that Adam just highlighted with marking how critical different things are. So again, if you aren't familiar with the exercise, it's available at MCTAC.org, and it's also been sent around electronically a few times, but you can access it right off of the Learning Community page on the MCTAC site. But the 5 sections that are covered in the Example Provider Services Agreement that Adam's pulled together are definitions, provider obligations, billing and compensation, term and termination, and general provisions. And so again, Adam's offered up his contact information if folks are getting in touch with him, as well as our standard MCTAC.info at nyu.edu and the MCTAC.org website, which is home to a great assortment and variety of resources. You can sign up for the newsletter, events that are are ongoing in terms of different areas of technical assistance and training. So MCTAC is really working to be like a one-stop shop, or clearinghouse, or whatever language you want to use for folks who are interested in supporting their agency's transition to Medicaid managed care. And off the top, one question that came through, can we send or tell attendees the link again for the survey? So let me just pull that up really quickly. So if you go to MCTAC.org/page/learning communities, at the very, very top is an overview of this contracting workshop series with a grid of all of the different steps and resources that you can take or use, including a link to submit the survey, as well as a PDF version so folks can print it out and review it without having to go directly to an online SurveyMonkey-like resource. So just off the top, I'm going to throw a few questions Adam's way. And as questions come in on our sidebar, we just really appreciate people's patience between questions as we take a quick look and get them in order. So off the top, Adam, did you want to revisit the offset law time limit?
Sure. I thought I would just add at the beginning as well, if I were sitting down to do the contract exercise, I would want to make sure that not only did I have in front of me the questions sort of in this exhibit that I just sort of highlighted before, those questions that you can ask in the Exhibit A, but also the slide deck that I did in the introductory webinar in this contracting workshop, because each of those slides have different provisions in the contract and identify how you'd want to sort of identify unfavorable provisions and how to make them more favorable. And that can really help you in reviewing the sample contract in addition to the questions in Exhibit A. The goal here is not to sort of keep the information from you. You should be able to look at the slides, look at those questions, and look at the sample contract provision by provision and identify what's favorable or unfavorable and how you'd want it changed. If you just look at the sample contract without any of those questions or the support from the webinar slides, I think you're making your life a lot more difficult than is intended. In addition, the goal here is really just to spot and identify favorable or unfavorable language and understand how you'd want to get it changed. you need not try to start drafting new contract language that you'd want to see in the final contract. The goal here is really just to identify favorable, unfavorable language and know for yourself how you'd want to see that changed. So now going on, as Dan said, before I hit the offset question, I think one of the questions perhaps on folks' minds is might relate to the new RFP that was issued on July 3rd. This was the behavioral health RFQ actually, and understand how that's different than the one that was previously issued on March 21st, 2014. What the state has done, as some of you know, is they divided up into two separate rounds, starting with New York City first as the first round, and then expanding to the rest of the state in the second round. So the first RFQ that was issued on March 21st, 2014, only related to New York City, and the one that's been released most recently on July 3rd now applies to the rest of the state. Even though these are two separate documents, two separate RFQs, requests for qualifications, on a substantive basis, you would find if you compared them to that they are substantially the same document. You can imagine that it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the state to have different requirements applying to counties outside of New York City than those in New York City. That would be, I think, administratively cumbersome on their part. Although I haven't looked at it provision by provision, I've looked at some provisions. The provisions that I've looked at are identical between the two documents, and I imagine that they are generally the same document, but for specific requirements, perhaps related to access standards or dates, but they are substantially the same document. And so the provisions that we're mostly talking about today, or I've talked about in the past, related to payment obligations, and payment terms, those are likely to be identical indeed between the two documents themselves. One of the questions that came up in the first webinar in this workshop was with regard to basically the offset law time limit. In other words, if a plan identified that you had an overpayment, how far back could the plan go in recouping those overpayments from you? I had mentioned in the prior webinar that under state law, the insurance law, the plans can only go back 24 months or 2 years. This is a different requirement than what's in the model contract that's issued to all the managed care plans. The model contract, I've mentioned a couple of times in the past, it's not the RFQ. It's actually another document which all the plans have as their agreement between Department of Health and them for Medicaid managed care. The RFQ document, you can kind of think of that as a special addendum that just relates to behavioral health services. But the overarching document that binds the state and the plans is this model managed care contract. And in that contract, the plans have 6 years to go back and identify and recoup any potential overpayments. That's a different time frame than the state law in regard to insurance law that only gives 24 months. Generally, state law would trump any contract that the state issues. The question here is this contract, this model contract, basically fall into an exception under state law that allows them to lengthen the time frame. I can't speak for how a court might resolve that. Generally, state law would take precedence, but there is a bit of an inconsistency between the state law and the Medicaid model contract, which gives up to 6 years to go back. I would say from a negotiation perspective, what would ultimately trump is your contract between you and the plan, because that can I guess further reduce the number of years I think that the plan has, because that's the document that binds you to them. So I would encourage you to try to seek a provision that only gives the plan 24 months to recoup any overpayments that they identify, and maybe that would be that would hold up hopefully and restrict them from going back any further, back to 6 years.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Adam. I'll give Adam a chance to take a breather and field a question about just the slides from the various contracting offerings. So again, your best bet for finding resources and recordings, and also just the PDFs of the slides that have been presented is MCTAC.org. And so under there, there's a tools, get the right tools tab across the top. And then by subject area, it's sorted under resources, and contracting is one of the more robust and built out sections of that. So the slides that we're presenting today is just a sampling of the previous two, or the last two web-based presentations that Adam's given. So we strongly encourage folks, if you want to review slides, to go back to the full presentations. And then, so just jumping back into some of the other questions that have come through. There's actually some contracting terminology here that I'm not familiar with, so I'm looking forward to this response. Adam, if your contract is evergreen, what avenue might you have to restructure or renegotiate if you come to a point where you have new services or see that you need new payment terms, et cetera?
Okay, that's a good question. So first, let's do some definitions. What's it mean to have an evergreen contract? That means a contract that automatically renews, essentially, if you do nothing. It just automatically renews at the end of the contract term. So if you have a 2-year contract term and you have an evergreen clause that allows the contract to automatically renew, it means that if you do nothing, that contract is going to automatically renew and bind you to the same terms as the prior term. Not necessarily a bad thing to have an evergreen contract. It keeps parties sort of bound to each other without having to formalize any new documents. Or amend the contract to have it continue to go forward beyond the contract term. But you always have this question in the back of your mind, what if we have new services or you want to amend the payment terms, what do we do? So one thing to think about is, even if you're not at the end of the contract term, you can always talk to the plan about that you have new services and that you want to amend the contract. Because probably under your contract with them, it probably gives the plan the right to amend the contract at any time with your consent, or the parties to amend the contract by mutual consent. So if you go to the plan and you say, you know, we now offer assertive community treatment, ACT services, and now we want to have that built into the contract rates, the plan can issue an amendment to you that would incorporate that service into your contract with a new provision related to contract rates. You don't have to wait to the end of the term in order to get those services within the contract. Now, in contrast, let's say you don't have new services, you just want to see an increase in rates or payment terms. You can still go to the plan and say, you know, even though it's not the end of the term, we'd like to negotiate rates. These are the same rates we've had for the last, 2 or 3 years. Our costs have gone up. We can't continue to operate under the existing fee schedule. What flexibility do you have to increase our rates at this time? And then if there's an opportunity for them to increase your rates, they can then again amend the contract by mutual consent. They'll offer you a new payment exhibit, for example. You'll say yes if you want that, if you want to accept those payment terms, and you'll sign that payment exhibit. And that will now be incorporated into the contract, and you'll have new payment rates. So you don't need to wait until the end of the contract term in order to ask for new rates or expand the scope of services. Now, if the plan says no, we're not interested in paying you anymore, paying you differently, we're not interested in expanding the services that you provide, then you may want to look at when that term of the contract is going to end. And now you can try to use that to gain some additional leverage. The way you would do that is if you see that the contract is ending, let's say, just make this easiest, by, let's say by March, let's say it ends March 30th, 2016, and you have to provide, 6 months notice, then you can send them a letter saying, consistent with our contract, where we are providing you notice of our right to terminate the contract, effective March 30th. However, we would be open to renewing that contract should we be able to mutually agree upon new rates. So what you've said to the plan is, number one, you're not happy with the rates, you're willing to terminate the contract because you don't want to deal with the current payment rates, and that if they want to include you and want the contract to go forward, then they have to really come to the table and negotiate new rates with you, otherwise you'll leave the network. As I've said in prior webinars, whether you have leverage really relates to whether you whether the services you provide can be provided or furnished by other providers within your same county. If you're the only game in town, that plan's going to have a problem if they don't include you in their network. They won't meet the network adequacy requirements or have services that they need to have within their network. That will give you a lot of leverage in those contract negotiations. In contrast, if there's a lot of other providers that render the same services within your county, essentially they're substitutes for you, or the plan can go out and find somebody else to provide those same services, you have a lot less leverage in those discussions, and the plan could say, well, we don't really need you, thanks very much, if you don't want to agree upon the payment terms that we're proposing. So you always have to assess whether you have leverage in your particular market, in your particular service area, to identify whether that plan really is free to walk away from you. And you won't know that just by asking the plan the question. You really have to do some due diligence and understand what competitors you have within your service area and what obligations the plan has in order to meet their own network adequacy requirements. So bottom line here in response to the question, which is a good one, if your contract's evergreen, you always have the ability to ask the plan for new payment terms at any point in the contract term, whether it's the beginning, middle, or end. If you have new services, same thing is true. Go to the plan and ask them for a plan amendment to adjust the terms, the payment terms, or the scope. If you're not successful in that endeavor, then you might think about providing notice to the plan of your intent to terminate in order to increase the leverage that you have, where now you're indicating to the plan that you're willing to walk away.
Great, thank you. And a question came in that I've heard Adam answer even more thoughtfully than even his standard answer, which is quite thoughtful, especially considering his position in all of this. But so, do you recommend, especially for smaller agencies, engagement with a counsel to manage communication between MCO reps and the contract review team, or engagement with a legal expert or a counsel in general to ensure we have a favorable position during negotiation?
I think, as I said in the past, if you can afford to do it, it is definitely going to be helpful in your process. If you think about, coming to the table with a managed care company, they have a lot of resources on their side. They have contract reps that are negotiating the terms on their behalf. They have legal counsel, both internal and external, to guide them and advise them on payment terms. If you're a provider organization, you're coming to the table at a disadvantage if you don't have those resources internally. At the same time, as a smaller organization, you have a limited budget, and you have to think about, I think, how to carefully basically use your resources. If you give yourself a budget for legal services, for example, then you want to be judicious about how you use them. Maybe it means that you engage a counsel to review one of your managed care contracts and provide you feedback and use that information to guide you on other contracts. If you can afford it, maybe you have that counsel negotiate the terms on your behalf with the plan. And because that can give you a leg up. Maybe you do this once or twice, using outside resources, and then in the future you take it within and you just use the information that you've learned from the process on your own. So you really have to sort of think about it from your own perspective. When is the right time to sort of use these resource dollars that you have? I guess I would say, from my experience, the most leverage you have in these contract negotiations is at the beginning of your contracts. That is when you're establishing the initial relationship with the managed care entities, or there's a new benefit that's coming into existence, like today with the behavioral health benefit being carved back into the MCO. The plans need you typically to meet their network adequacy requirements. They don't have their networks yet. And you have the most leverage in these discussions with the plans at this point, and just think about that, so that if you're thinking about how to basically leverage that leverage that you have, this may be the time you want to engage outside resources to help you, to get you in the best position as you can that will last you for the next few years. Rather than waiting to do it, 2 or 3 years from now, where you won't have that same leverage because you'll already either be a participant in the network, or because the plan will have other providers to contract with, or whatnot. So just be careful how you think about how you leverage these resources so that you can basically get the best contract you have.
Great. And I also received an important clarification on something that was said earlier in terms of where some of these resources from past presentations, FAQs, et cetera, live on the MCTAC website. So just to be clear, the recordings and slides from the in-person offerings and past web-based offerings outside of this workshop series are on the MCTAC page under Tools and Resources, and then Contracting. Slides and recordings and the materials for this workshop series are specifically under the Learning Community page. So thank you very much to my colleague and partner in crime, Morgan McGuire, for making that important distinction for folks. So back to the Q&A. One question that came through, or actually a few questions that came through, are around timeline. And as the date for implementation in New York City is approaching with October 1st, it's understandable that that's where a lot of people's minds are. So just to quickly synthesize, so Adam, can you talk a little bit about if an MCO is communicating a requested time frame in terms of when to have a signed contract back to them by, what that means in terms of like requirements to the provider. So for example, if an MCO tells a provider that a contract needs to be signed and sealed and delivered within 1 month, is that something that there's wiggle room on, or is that kind of a firm deadline that providers should be responsive to?
So I think from a strategic point of view, the first thing you ever want to find out when a plan gives you a deadline is the basis or the rationale for that deadline, and because that will inform you about whether that's really a real deadline, whether there's any flexibility on that deadline or not. I imagine that after the behavioral health sort of expansion occurs, the plans will have to demonstrate to DOH or OMH or ASAS that they meet the network adequacy requirements, and therefore there's probably a specific deadline in which the plans must have and must be able to prove to the state agencies that they have a sufficient number of providers in their network. So probably if they give you a deadline, it's so that they have you in their contract by the point in time they have to submit the list of their providers to the state. And therefore that is probably a real deadline, and you want to make that deadline because you want to make sure you have the leverage that will only occur prior to that deadline. In other words, if that deadline passes and they've met their network adequacy requirements and you don't have a contract with them yet, then when you're coming to negotiate with them, they won't really need you as much because they've already met their network network adequacy requirements. You have your leverage before they have proven to the state or met their network adequacy requirements. So you should sort of be mindful of their deadlines in which they have to prove compliance to the state. In contrast, if the plan comes to you and makes up a deadline and says, we really need you to return this by such and such a date, and you find out this is just sort of for internal purposes so that they have a larger network or something else, then there may be some flexibility there, and you can go back to the plan and ask for some additional time. I've seen these deadlines come and go, and when they go, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're locked out of being a contract network provider. It may mean that you have to wait another half a month or 30 days until you are incorporated into the plan's network because there may be a delay in processing your application, or there may be a delay in which they build you into their system, the claim system, so that you can submit claims. So long and short of it, there may be legitimate reasons in some cases for why they have a deadline, but do go ask the plan why they have that deadline, because then you'll know why. Otherwise, there may be some flexibility. If you have a month to turn around the contract, that really should be enough to review the contract and negotiate any provisions. The more difficult situations, I would say, is when you have a week or 48 hours in which the plan is expecting you to turn around the contract, and that's really not enough time to thoroughly review it and negotiate any provisions that you need changed.
Great.
I see one of the questions that come in is there a resource to identify what plans are accepted? by our area providers. There is actually a document that lives, I believe it's on the Department of Health website, which indicates what Medicaid managed care plans serve each of the various counties in New York State. And so you can look at your particular counties and see what plans have agreed to the state to provide coverage. And that can help you identify what plans are accepted by your area providers. I don't think this is true on the insurance side, on the commercial insurance side, that the state insurance commission provides that. That would be really nice if they did. But I'm sure that they do provide it on the state Medicaid side, and that can tell you what plans serve your counties.
Gotcha. And Adam, I'm sending you over something that was just sent to me, which is an example an example provision for an Evergreen contract. So just flagging that it's coming your way.
Okay, I'll look out for it.
Excellent. If you can take a quick look at that. And in the meantime, I'll take the chance just to also say that in terms of which plans are active in which counties, we are launching with all intention this upcoming Monday, just putting some final touches and finishing off the beta testing on an interactive website that allows providers or anyone who's interested to click on a region or county of New York State and pull up the contact information, the respective contact information for all of the plans that are active there, as well as some of the nuance in their approach to contracting with termination clauses and other things. So please be on the lookout for that, and we'll be rolling that out next week. And if there are other pieces of information or tools that we can here at MCTAC pull together centrally that would be useful for the broader universe, we're always happy to look at that. So Adam, did you happen to see that sample provision?
Yes. So that's a great provision. Let me, I guess, read the provision and say why it's such a good provision. The provision that was sent over is an evergreen clause, and it says that this agreement will be effective upon the effective date, and its initial term shall continue in effect until the next succeeding June 30th, at which time both parties may agree to renegotiate the contract terms or renew the contract for a one-year term ending June 30th the following year. The contract is considered renewed if neither party submits in writing to the other the intent to renegotiate the terms of the contract at least 60 days prior to the expiration of the contract. So in other words, under that provision, the contract automatically renews, so it's an evergreen clause, if neither party submit to each other notice to renegotiate the terms of the contract at least 60 days prior to the expiration. So if you want to change the terms, you have to provide notice to the other party, and because it's official notice under the contract, you have to follow the notice clause in the contract, which may tell you where to send the contract, whether you have to overnight it by courier, send it by first-class mail, the requirements for how you formally notify the other party. You have to do it 60 days in advance, and then if you do that, then it won't automatically renew for another year because you've provided that notice. Or the plan can do the same to you. They can provide you notice 60 days in advance of the expiration that they want to renegotiate the terms. So I like that provision. I think that's a good model provision to have because it says right in the contract term provision or evergreen clause that you can inform the other that you want to renegotiate the terms. You just have to provide that 60-day notice to the other party.
That's great. And then we got a question about different lines of businesses and contracting. So if a provider specifically wants to contract for Medicaid, for a Medicaid line of business exclusively, and not necessarily build in Medicare or commercial, what's the best way for them to go about that if what they've gotten from an MCO includes the other lines?
So the first thing I would do is basically go back to the HMO and just tell them that. We only want to contract on the Medicaid line of business. We're not interested in commercial or exchange or Medicare. And you may need to explain why. I mean, you can say the rates are too low, that they're not operationally feasible for us or economically feasible for us. And ask them to remove the language that pertains to those other lines of business so that you just have, you're just agreeing to provide Medicaid services or just to Medicaid beneficiaries. Now, the plan may push back on that. I think I've said in the past, there's no all products clause prohibition in the state of New York. In other words, there's no prohibition that bars plans from insisting that a provider participate in all of its lines of business, Medicaid, Medicare, commercial, exchange. However, some plans have said, when I've negotiated with them, that they are okay with removing one of those lines of business. I had one recently say that they took out the health exchange line of business because it was not favorable as far as payment terms to that provider. They agreed to do that voluntarily. Some of you may know that there was legislation in Albany that passed both the House and the Senate that would have prohibited the plans having all products clauses. Unfortunately, it did not get approved prior to the end of the session. They did get very far, so I mean, it was amazing that it did get as far as it did, particularly because the plans were opposing the legislation in Albany, but nevertheless, it did pass. Houses individually. Nevertheless, the state has indicated, OMH and OASAS has indicated that they will include a provision in the Medicaid Managed Care Contract, model contract, that would bar a Medicaid plan from requiring a provider to participate in the plan's other lines of business, commercial, exchange, Medicare. Now, the model contract hasn't been amended yet, so I can't promise you that it's going to appear there, but that is their indication. That's the state indicating is that they would prohibit an all products clause essentially in the contracts. I'm hopeful that that will happen, particularly with the support in Albany. It looks like there's support from Albany for such a requirement, but we just don't know yet for certain until that model contract is amended by the state.
That's really helpful. A question came in about the rest of state RFQ, and again, timeline that folks might be anticipating or expecting. But so for providers who are outside of New York City, with the rest of state RFQ for MCOs just going out on July 3rd, when can they realistically expect to have to begin negotiating contracts with the MCOs?
Well, I would go ahead and I would ask the MCOs that are going to participate, because they've been the mainstream plans in the past. I'd ask them for contracts. I know providers are doing this, and I know the plans are sending them out. Particularly for plans that serve both New York City already as well as the rest of the state. They already, are in the process of amending their contracts and going through that process. They may be able to get to you contracts sooner than those plans if they're just serving the rest of the state. So this is happening right now. So basically request those contracts and begin negotiating those terms. The sooner you start that process, I think the better you are. Again, the sooner you get into it, the more leverage you have and the better terms that you're likely to have as well.
That's great. And it's also something, just as a quick aside, that we'll add to our list of questions or policy-related questions for the state, just so we can get a better sense here on our end of just what they anticipate the timeline around the RFP and some of these contracting things to look like, as well as follow up with this all products clause and the model contract. And there was another question that came up in the last webinar, talking about changes to the base contract having to be reviewed and approved to by DOH prior to being executed. And as we said, the general rule is yes, that the plans have to have their contracts approved by DOH, including changes. And then we're following up just in terms of like the extent of the changes that have to be reviewed. Unless Adam, you know something off the top of your head, in addition to what we said previously.
No, the plans do have to get their templates approved by the state. Obviously, the plans have discretion. They can negotiate different payment terms provider to provider. And so clearly the plans don't have to go back to the state to those types of differences. The question is, how extensive do the differences have to be, and which would require them to go back to get state approval. That's going to be a little bit up to the plan to decide whether it feels that it's obligated to go back to the state or not. I think from your perspective, from a provider perspective, you can try to tell the plan that they don't need to go back to get approval to make a particular change, but it's really going to be ultimately the plan's say on whether they feel obligated to or not.
Okay, great. And we're running close to 1:30, so just wanted to encourage folks if they have any last burning questions to please send those our way, and anything we're not able to get to during this webinar, we'll absolutely make sure to address during the concluding final analysis results later this month on July 29th. But while folks give it just one last bit of thought, wanted to revisit another question that was particularly helpful in a previous discussion. So if a provider already has if a provider already has signed a contract, is it too late to modify?
If you've already signed a contract and there's a term, for a particular period of time, a year or 2 years, then you are locked into those terms for that contract. However, nothing bars the providers from amending the contract. So if the plan is willing to amend the payment terms or amend the terms for the scope of services, then you certainly can seek an amendment, and those terms can change. So it's not too late to seek an amendment or to seek a change. However, if the plan says no, then you're probably out of luck, and you're going to probably have to live with those terms until the end of the contract term, whatever that might be, a year or 2 years or whatnot.
Terrific, really helpful. I know everyone's on mute, but I hope you'll join me in thanking Adam for his insights and his expertise on the areas of managed care contracting, specific to Medicaid transition in New York State. And just again, encouraging folks to please go onto the website, download the activity, submit your responses to us by 5 p.m. on Monday, July 20th. Again, we'll have a short chance to take a close look at the responses and identify some of the trends coming through and not coming through that we'd like to highlight to folks to be conscious and aware of. And then we'll be reviewing all of this in greater detail on July 29th at 9:30 in the morning. So have an extra cup of coffee and look forward to joining us then. So again, thank you to Adam, and any questions in the meantime, feel free to send them our way at mctac.info@nyu.edu. And thanks so much for joining us today.